This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland.
You're listening to the 6th programme of Giving the Greatest Good, and in this programme we investigate the remarkable story of James and Mary Ellis of Letterfrack in County Galway.
The Ellises came here moved by accounts from the famine.
The Ellises came in, they offered employment, they offered food, they offered advancement, development in the area.
James Ellis, he would have been comparable to a multi-millionaire money-wise, and he just ploughed his money in, he just ploughed his money there.
They employed a lot of people, so it wasn't really charity, they actually employed people, but they were known as good employers, paid generously.
They never asked you to compromise your faith.
They really had this kind of vision that yes, we can do something, and we can do something very practical.
They were very work-oriented. They were certainly visionaries. You know, all in all, I would say just remarkable and practical people.
They took to the people and the people took to them.
They certainly did a huge amount of good for the whole Connemara area. Definitely they would have been hugely important.
It's a story showing that always there are good people and that good people actually are effective.
They tried to do the greatest amount of good.
I'm Paul Wright and welcome to the 6th programme of Giving the Greatest Good. In our last programme we threw light on the remarkable story of the Quaker businessman Joseph Beale from Mountmellick in County Laois. We heard how he helped stave off hunger and destitution for many people in his community during the grim famine years from 1845 to 1850. However, there were also many other people working to alleviate suffering caused by the Great Famine around this time. Two such people were the Quaker couple James and Mary Ellis from Bradford in England. In 1849, the Ellises left their native Bradford to go live in Letterfrack in County Galway. And before we hear about their work in Connemara, well, first here's Connemara historian Kathleen Villiers-Tuttle to explain just how chronic things had become in Connemara due to the famine.
The famine was extremely bad here in Connemara because Connemara, as you will know, those of you who have travelled through it, is a very remote area. It still is today. It was extremely remote in those days because it was cut off from the rest of the world. Very poor road communications, some piers, not a great many, and a very big population of very poor people.
Well, in Connemara in general, the famine was very serious.
Connemara historian Brendan O'Scanall.
All over the whole area, I mean, population was just wiped out. I mean, people were all saying because of the sea that people should have been able to survive longer there. But nobody expected it to last as long, and people weren't really prepared for it. That was the kind of thing that it took people by surprise, even though it was there for a while. In fact, it went on for years, obviously. It really did cause huge problems throughout Connemara. I mean, all over the area, there's stories of mass emigration, death. Every part of Connemara have famine graveyards. So, I mean, there was quite a lot of people died here. Letterfrack itself wasn't too badly hit, and certainly once the Ellises arrived and things started to get better. But Letterfrack was an exception, particularly post-famine, whereas other areas were still losing people because even though the famine kind of had a particular time of starting and finishing, it didn't really work that way as such. So most parts of Connemara suffered, but Letterfrack improved an awful lot once the Ellises arrived.
So why was Letterfrack village, situated along the coastline of West Connemara, the exception to the general rule of death and starvation throughout Connemara at this time? And who exactly were the Ellises? To explain, here's Joan Johnson, historian and also author of the book James Mary Ellis, Background and Quaker Famine Relief in Letterfrack.
Well, James and Mary Ellis lived in Bradford. James was a successful woolen merchant, 56 years of age, and his wife. Now, he had heard reports of the horrendous destitution out in the west of Ireland.
and it would have been through the two English Quakers, William Edward Forster and James Tuke, who'd undertaken fact-finding missions in famine-ravaged areas of the west of Ireland during the 1840s, that James Ellis first learned about the enormity of the famine crisis engulfing Ireland. Joan Johnson.
I think William Forster had a huge influence, and James Tuke, who were both in that area. And in Quaker circles, the practice is that if somebody's been away on a tour or whatever, they would come back and actually speak to the group, that the Quakers in the area. And I would say Forster and Tuke would have passed on the news about it.
After they had conducted their tours of the famine-stricken areas of Ireland, basically, especially the western seaboard.
West. I mean, William Edward Forster and Tuke were in the west of Ireland in the autumn of 46, and Tuke went back in 47. And I would say James was at some of the meetings, the public meetings. Tuke was a fine speaker, as so was Forster. And Forster continued, and Tuke, to have an interest in Ireland right up to their deaths.
And in describing to the general public just how horrendous the situation in Ireland was, Forster told the truth exactly as he saw it.
In one cabin we visited, there were two emaciated men lying at full length on the damp floor in ragged clothes, too weak to move, actually worn down to skin and bone. In yet another cabin we found another young man. I shall never forget the resigning, uncomplaining tone with which he told me that all the medicine he wanted was food.
So what effect, if any, did such graphic reports of Ireland's plight have on James Ellis? Joan Johnson.
Ellis must have been fired up and finished his work as a business. And it was his personal response. He decided with himself and Mary to actually go and live in Letterfrack, build a house. He bought 1,000 acres there with the express purpose of giving employment to the area. Now, I might add that the family nearly had a fit in Bradford, because they weren't giving him that much encouragement. They thought the west of Ireland, as in those days, would have been a difficult place to live in.
However, whatever the objections of James and Mary Ellis's extended family, and however foreboding going to live in a famine-ravaged west of Ireland must have seemed, nevertheless the Ellises believed they had a personal duty to help alleviate suffering in Ireland. Here's what Connemara local historian Kieran O'Donoghue had to say on what perhaps motivated the Ellises to come to Letterfrack.
I don't think they saw it as brave. I mean, they saw it as, to them, it was part of their faith, their altruism of helping others. The Quakers were heavily involved in famine relief work in Ireland, so the word had spread among different Quaker communities about how desperate people were and the effects of the famine, so on and so forth.
They had this great religious and great social conscience. And
historian Brendan O'Scanall.
They felt that the people here were suffering so badly. They'd heard reports, and there was plenty of travellers, Quaker relief organisations around the place, and they would have got to know what life was like. And they just felt that they had something to offer, and that they wanted to come over and to do something very practical. I mean, this was the great thing, I suppose, about the Quakers, was that, you know, it wasn't just kind of, they weren't holy Joes. They put their lives basically on the line and said, well, we're going to do something to help these people.
It was certainly courageous, but I think that was part of their philosophy. They were risk takers, and they certainly took risks, you know, with their own money. They were not cautious people in that sense. They were very methodical, from what I understand, very practical.
Indeed, Mary Ellis's niece Charlotte later wrote the following on why James and Mary Ellis moved from their comfortable life in Bradford to the faraway alien world of Ireland's Connemara.
Believing that the accumulation of riches was a snare to parents and a source of great injury to children, in the year 1848 James Ellis retired from business, setting by this step, as well as throughout life by the simplicity of his establishments, a bright example of Christian moderation.
And whatever the reasons for the Ellises leaving their secure world in Bradford, the raw reality was that in 1849 they set sail across the Irish Sea to begin a totally new chapter in their lives. So just how big a step would it have been for them? Brendan O'Scanall.
It was a huge change. I mean, it's like leaving from the middle of a city into the complete rural area. I mean, that's difficult for anybody at any stage. I mean, it's ideal if you look at it from the point of view of, let's say, a holiday or something. You can kind of say, oh, this is great, I like to live in Clifton or in Connemara. But to actually kind of change from one part to another, and so, you know, it's a huge, huge change. And I suppose you could say, I mean, definitely they would have been naive. I'm sure they had no idea what they were letting themselves in for. Absolutely not.
Oh, I think it would have been a huge step for them. And I mentioned there that the family were worried.
Historian Joan Johnson.
Now, Mary, she had lived in Hitchin. And, I mean, in Hitchin, from my research, it was a very close Quaker community there. And the Quakers at that stage were fairly inward looking. I mean, they had gone through this quietness stage, and they were keeping very much to themselves. They were quite strict in their discipline. And for example, they weren't keen on their members marrying out. And if they did, my goodness, they were disowned. You know, it was quite strict at that stage. So Mary would have been quite a quiet person, so I would think it was a major feat for her to actually come over. She writes to say she's quite apprehensive about it, and she's also wondering what kind of a reception they get there.
So just how exactly did the Ellises travel from their native Bradford, situated in the middle of England, to the rural outpost of Letterfrack, situated on the western seaboard of one of the most underdeveloped corners of Queen Victoria's kingdom, where the inhabitants didn't even speak the Queen's tongue? Brendan O'Scanall.
They would have travelled to Dublin first and then travelled through Ireland, possibly stopping off visiting other Quakers along the way and getting kind of help and information and all of that, because they were literally going into the great unknown. It would be like going to the middle of Africa and not knowing anything about the place. So they actually would have kind of stopped off and talked to people, and then they'd have come here by carriage, you know, a horse and carriage.
And how did they transport their stocks and supplies? Letterfrack local historian Pádraig Lydon.
Well, they did have a yacht, and a lot of their stuff, I think, came around by sea and into Letterfrack Bay.
So what cultural differences would the Ellises have encountered on their arrival into Letterfrack in 1849? Brendan O'Scanall.
The first one would have been the language. I mean, they would have been speaking English, and quite a lot of people around here would have been speaking Gaelic, obviously, at that stage. I mean, right up to the end of the 19th century, Gaelic would have been the language of all of Connemara. There would have been little pockets of people speaking English, but I mean, it wouldn't have been a general one. So I suppose that's the biggest challenge. I mean, you know, language is always a huge problem, no matter where you go. They would also have lack of facilities, would have been another very important thing, that people were very very poor, very poverty-stricken. They certainly wouldn't have had facilities. Like, they came from a city, they would have had all sorts of things laid on. They'd have had no water, no electricity, no, anything of that nature.
The church would have been suspicious of them, because they would have been looking at them and thinking, oh yes, maybe they're wanting to proselytise. Well, there's no evidence of that whatsoever.
And now that the Ellises had arrived into Letterfrack, how did things progress for them? Joan Johnson.
They settled down there. He brought his wife, and he brought his son, James Austin, and his daughter, Catherine. So it was a family unit that came, and they settled down. It was barren land, so he built his house. He built his house in record time, 5 months it took. He started to give employment, and in the end he was employing 90 men and some women in the area, and laying out the estate.
Indeed, the Ellises engaged in laying out and developing not only their own farm estate, but also the nucleus of what is now Letterfrack village. Historian Kieran O'Donoghue.
They had a view that the best way of helping people who were poor was to provide employment, education, facilities and services. During their period here, for example, they provided houses for some of their workers. They provided dispensary for a doctor. In fact, the nucleus of the village, even as you see it today around the crossroads, was built by the Quakers.
Emboldened by Erin's grievous mind, the Ellises from Bradford came on the scene. Working hard from 49, they gave schools jobs and something fine.
However, the laying out of a fledgling model village, even one as remote as Letterfrack, would have been a concept quite familiar and welcome to the Ellis' Quaker mindset. Joan Johnson.
James and Mary Ellis, of course, laid out the village, really. Now, this would have been a practice. You'll see it in Great Britain. The Roundtrees did it in York, in Birmingham, the Cadburys did it. And, of course, here in Ireland, Portlaw was a Quaker village and laid out. So it was something familiar and the ideas were there, because before that it was just a crossroads and bridle roads were coming in and out. And so when you go to Letterfrack, you come in and you have this crossroads, and to the right you'll see Ellis's land.
Be not afraid to proclaim their deeds, those brave few souls who answered needs.
And so James and Mary Ellis initiated a building scheme in Letterfrack, and within a few years had completely changed the face of what had previously been a simple crossroads. With their 90 or so full-time local workforce, they built their own 2-storey family abode, a school, a medical dispensary, many labourers' cottages, and even a temperance hotel and many other buildings, just too numerous to mention. These buildings were constructed so well that most of them still stand to this day. Porrick, Leiden.
Like most of the buildings that they built are still there, you know. Like the what's up there now is the Bard's Den. That was the shop they built. Down the road, like there's a private house there now. There's 2 wings on it, built onto each side. But that was the dispensary they built, you know. It's on that bad turn as you go down the road. They built all those workshops that are up there now in the Connemara West complex, which are private houses now. There's some photographs like where there's a huge big shed like up where the visitor centre now in the national park is. That was built by originally built by James Mary Ellis. Now the Christian Brothers, when they had it, there was a cow parlour or a cow shed for milking cows. That was built by them, you know, and that's actually still standing there. It's now, you know, part of the visitor centre. But all of that was built by them, you know. So there was a huge investment. He built his own house, which is the old monastery, they call it now, the old monastery hostel. That was built by James and Mary Ellis when they arrived. I think it took 5 months just to build it, and they built the damn thing up against the mountain, you know. I mean, how they managed to do it, I don't know, like, because there's floods coming down, like, and they still come down underneath it, you know. It's a mighty piece of engineering, however it was done. They built a stone house.
Emboldened by Erin's grievous mind, the Ellises from Bradford came on the scene. Working hard from 49, they gave...
And concerning the Ellis' family home built up against the side of a mountain, Kieran O'Donoghue shares his views.
They were very much hands-on people. I mean, it wasn't a case of they having a design for their house, giving it to somebody and coming back a year later to go into it. They Where they stayed or how they lived here when it was being built, I'm not too sure. But it was certainly built in double quick time, and it was a very substantial house.
From 49, they gave schools jobs and something fine.
And historian Joan Johnson had this to say about other buildings constructed during this productive period in Letterfrack.
They set up a little shop, a dispensary, and little cottages for their employees. So basically they set out what we see now as Letterfrack, the village there. And the cottages seem to be very typical. I mean, you go along and you can actually see them and have them pointed out to you. And the Lawrence collection, when you see them there, which is absolutely great to have them there round about the time of Ellis. And so they set out Letterfrack. And I mean, the next big village was Clifton, south, and Westport. So, I mean, they put in infrastructure there in modern terms, so that now anybody going from Clifton to Westport goes through Letterfrack and stops there.
When the Ellises came here, as you know, moved by accounts from the famine, they founded there wasn't a village in Letterfrack at that period, and they founded the village here because it was close to a good pier.
Letterfrack local resident Mary Ruddy.
So there is a nice kind of architecture in the place. They're decent sized buildings, but very modest. And also in the village there were other dwellings for the labourers. And there's still evidence of those dwellings in the village and in the area around it.
And another thing of paramount importance to the Ellises was education. And for this reason, they built a local school, Joan Johnson.
They set up a school. They wanted to... Quakers were, from the very beginning, wanted education. And it was co-education, this right from the beginning.
A co-ed school in the middle of Letterfrack,
yes.
Would have been the first, certainly, in this region anyway, most certainly.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure about the national system, but I think probably out here, the girls and boys would have been probably educated together in national school, at national school level. But yes, I mean, the schoolhouse is still there, and they got that going.
Yet, amid the building boom initiated by the Ellises, certain prohibitions nevertheless existed.
There wouldn't have been any drinking or pubbing or anything like that. Ellis would have been from the temperance camp, and I think he built a temperance hotel as well. So they wouldn't have wanted any drink around. And
that would have been a hard-fought battle. There's no doubt about it. Certainly you were going against the tide there.
Yes. But they wouldn't have been... That would have been their call, as it were. And many Quakers, I mean, to this day, don't drink. But certainly, and the temperance movement, Quakers would have supported that. So the temperance hall was built as a statement. So, because, to be honest with you, I could see James, he'd pay these men and he wouldn't want them to be going in and drinking it all. It'd be a waste of his money. And they refer to that. In fact, once the house was built, after 5 months, they had a party and there was no drink at it, and well, officially anyway.
However, the Ellis' temperance stance was easily forgiven by locals, given the fact that James Ellis, as well as being one of the largest employers in the area, also paid his employees a weekly wage well above the going rate. Porrick Leiden.
They paid over the wages for the local landlord. I think there's about a quarter extra payment to their workers, which wasn't appreciated, I don't think, by the local landlord. But they, not alone was James active, but Mary herself was active, in going out and meeting the people and helping them, So they left a lasting impression anyway on the place,
So just how popular did the Ellises become with the local landlords? Joan Johnson.
Well, I don't think they were too popular, to be honest with you, but from my research, it didn't bother James. He felt he was doing the right thing and giving the wage for the purpose of helping the local people.
Indeed, in a letter from Letterfrack in April 1849, Mary Ellis wrote as follows to her sister Esther in England.
James finds there are complaints at his giving his labourers even 8pence a day. He thinks their labour is worth more, but supposes it will not do to advance further while his neighbours give only 6pence. A finer race of people no one could wish to see, gentle, polite, cheerful, and easily made happy. It is indeed a beautiful country.
So what was the net result of James Ellis's fair wage policy to his employees?
He would pay them weekly and they would get their package of pay every Friday. And this seems to have sustained Letterfrack, because if the census forms for the 10 years over that time, Letterfrack's population only dropped by 1. And all around the towns were, the populations were decreasing.
Decimated.
Yes. So he's...
Many cases.
Oh, absolutely wiped out. And I think James Ellis was similar to others who had to respond personally. Now, everybody can't do that, but he was in a position, he would have been comparable to a multi-millionaire, money-wise, and he just ploughed his money in. He just ploughed his money there. He wasn't prepared. He wasn't looking for a return. In fact, he mentions that he wasn't expecting a return, but that's what he wished to do.
For those working for the Ellises, their appearances and their clothing had been gradually changed for the better since they obtained employment with them. The men were working very hard from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening, with proper intervals for breakfast and dinner, for wages varying according to their several capacities from 7pence to 9pence a day. They are paid regularly in money wages, and they show themselves not only contented but grateful.
This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. And to find out what occurs next in the remarkable story of James and Mary Ellis and how they helped to stave off hunger and destitution for large numbers of people in Connemara during the grim famine years, then make sure to catch our next number 7 programme in this larger 9-part Giving the Greatest Good series. Until then, from myself, Paul Wright, bye for now.
Emboldened by Erin's grievous mind, the Ellises from Bradford came on the scene. Working hard from 49, they gave schools jobs and something fine. Be not afraid to proclaim their deeds, those brave few souls who answered needs. To countless victims unable to cope, they were the few warriors of hope. Jacob Harvey's love for man shone bright. He too paid the ultimate price, helping Irish in New York. He died from overwork, but others survived. Be not afraid to proclaim their deeds, the brave few who answered others' needs. The countless victims unable to cope, they were the warriors of hope. Be not afraid to proclaim their deeds, the brave few answered others' needs. The countless victims unable to cope, they were the few warriors of hope.